University of Winchester. And I'd like to talk to you a little bit about belonging and diversity in education in relation to the experiences of children seeking sanctuary. I'd like to start by reflecting on the words of Ron Baker. Ron Baker was a professor of social work in the UK, and reflecting on his own experiences as a child fleeing Nazi Germany, finding refuge in England. Professor Baker wrote of the ways in which displaced and uprooted people can be dramatically stripped of what he called a relationship web. And this web, he said, holds a person in position of their own culture by a range of links and relationships to other people, organizations, and social structures. And once removed from what Baker calls this relationship web, a person is, in Baker's words, alienated from their cultural roots. Baker says the refugee is thrown onto his own resources. And Baker describes the consequences of this loss in a very haunting way. He writes, "Such loneliness contains what I call a dead, still center, a feeling which is extremely difficult to describe, especially if you're a child, and even more difficult to understand and emphasize with if you're a concerned, helping person." The philosopher Hannah Arendt spoke in a similar way of what Hannah Arendt called the web of human relationships. And in that web of human relations, it's possible for a person to discover and to announce what Hannah Arendt calls who they are, in contrast to what they are. And this distinction that Hannah Arendt makes between who someone is and what they are is the difference between someone announcing and discovering their unique identity and someone merely being reduced to what one has been through, what one looks like, and what one has done. But Arendt was clear that to reveal who we are, we need to be part of this web of human relations. And I think this immediately has important consequences for thinking about diversity and belonging in education. Immediately it says that we need to see students who are seeking sanctuary as something more than what they have been through, what they've endured, something more than refugee or asylum-seeking students. We have to try and give them resources so that they can be part of a web of human relations where they can begin to discover who they might be, who they might become. And in fact, Hannah Arendt wrote about her own experiences of fleeing Nazi Germany in a rather bitter and ironic essay called We Refugees. And in that essay, she described how Jewish refugees could attempt to respond to the upheaval, being excluded from their relationship webs by attempting to assimilate into new societies. Arendt says that some of the Jewish refugees were optimistic and that they optimistically tried to forget the places that they had lived and were forced to leave. However, Hannah Arendt notes that under the cover of optimism, you could detect what Hannah Arendt calls the hopeless sadness of assimilationists. In other words, it's Arendt's view that the optimism of the Jewish refugees was a way of, not a way of facing the future, but a way of forgetting the past. So, if we're concerned with belonging and diversity in education, I think it's important that we work hard to ensure that children who have been forced from their homes don't feel that they're in a position where they have to assimilate in order to belong to the schools. Hannah Arendt says about the Jewish refugees that for them, in her words, assimilation meant that we adjust in principle to everything and everybody. So assimilation means forgetting one's identity, forgetting one's past, and attempting to fit in. Raina Naeri, for example, in her memoir, very powerful memoir called The Ungrateful Refugee, writes of her escape from Iran as a child and her experiences of finally finding refuge in America. And Naeri recalls how in the Oklahoma school she attended, her success in producing a paper mache topographical map of the United States came to be, as she described it, strangely central to her teacher's efforts to support what Naeri calls American assimilation. Well, Naeri tells us that she explained to her teacher that she had been a refugee living in Italy just a few months previously, but that the teacher responded in Naeri's words sleepily with the following words: "Ah, sweetie, you must be so grateful to be here." And in this word grateful, there's both a judgment and a demand. And indeed, throughout her memoir, Naeri conveys the burden of gratitude that must be carried by students who are seeking sanctuary. She suggests to us that such students can feel a constant pressure to demonstrate that they're glad not only to be in the new country and to be within this new school, but also that they're grateful not to be in their homeland, grateful that they are living in this new setting. So assimilation then is the very opposite of both diversity and belonging. One way of understanding the importance of belonging in education might be supported by considering Hannah Arendt's distinction between solitude and loneliness. Hannah Arendt tells us that solitude involves keeping oneself company, but loneliness occurs when one's alone but uncomfortable with one's own company. And Arendt says this is so important to experience that solitude because it is, in Arendt's words, a way of striking roots, a way of taking place in the world. Arendt says what we usually call a person or a personality, as distinguished from a mere human being or a nobody, actually grows out of this root-striking process of thinking. In other words, belonging, having a sense of belonging in the world, belonging in one's own skin, depends on having that opportunity to think and to remember. How can schools create spaces where children can create and can experience solitude, especially children who are seeking sanctuary. How can we enable such children to have spaces where they can think and remember and gain a sense of belonging? Well, Professor Julian Stern has written about 3 kinds of spaces that schools and other educational settings can create that allow children to experience, and young people to experience, solitude. He says there should be first spaces that are quiet, where children can read and therefore dialogue with distant people and places. Second, there should be spaces that are natural and beautiful, where Stern says children may dialogue with nature. And finally, there's what Stern calls daydreaming spots, thoughtful places, where children may come into dialogue with themselves and keep themselves company. This suggests that education can be a place where children can enroot themselves, can find a place in the world. But this means, first of all, preparing children to be part of what both Hannah Arendt and Ron Baker describe as a web of relationships. It also means that schools can be places where children can withdraw and experience the kind of solitude that enables them to be with themselves. And this is in complete contrast to the kind of places where children feel the constant pressure to assimilate, to forget themselves. I've been speaking a lot about the German philosopher Hannah Arendt. She did actually write a very beautiful essay about education, one that she called The Crisis in Education. She ended that essay by saying, education is the point at which we decide whether we love the world enough to assume responsibility for it. And education, too, is where we decide whether we love our children enough not to expel them from our world and leave them to their own devices, not to strike from their hands their chance of undertaking something new, something unforeseen by us, but to prepare them in advance for the task of renewing a common world. Well, education can also be the place where children seeking sanctuary discover that they're loved enough to be guided to a world they will share with others, and where they're also encouraged to be with themselves, to remember, to think, and hopefully in time to begin to heal.